The MG-17 was one of the earliest weapons that helped transform German warplanes from simple reconnaissance aircraft into lethal fighting machines. Developed in the early 1930s, this 7.9mm machine gun became the backbone of Luftwaffe fighter armament during the opening years of World War II, mounted primarily in the wings and nose of aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Heinkel He-1 and 11. The MG-17 was designed for speed, reliability, and synchronization. Its most important feature was its ability to fire directly through a spinning propeller without striking the blades, a technological advantage that gave German pilots greater accuracy in dogfights. With a firing rate of approximately 1,200 rounds per minute, the MG-17 allowed pilots to unleash dense streams of bullets in short bursts. While the caliber was relatively small, German tactics emphasized precision and concentration of fire rather than brute force. During the invasions of Poland and France, the MG-17 proved deadly against lightly armored aircraft. Enemy pilots often described seeing long, accurate tracer lines slicing through the sky before impact. In these early campaigns, the MG-17 helped secure air superiority for Germany. However, as Allied aircraft became faster and more heavily armored, the limitations of rifle-caliber weapons became obvious. The MG-17 struggled to inflict serious damage on modern bombers, forcing German engineers to develop heavier cannons. Even so, the MG-17 represents the first step in Germany's evolution toward airborne firepower. It laid the groundwork for the brutal escalation that would soon turn German aircraft into true flying death machines. The MG-151-20 was one of the most feared aircraft cannons of World War II, and a major reason German fighters became so lethal in the skies. Originally designed as a 15mm weapon, German engineers quickly upgraded it to fire devastating 20mm high-explosive shells. Installed on aircraft such as the Bf-1 and 9, FW-190, and Me-262, the MG-151-20 struck a perfect balance between firepower accuracy and rate of fire. Unlike earlier machine guns, this cannon could destroy enemy aircraft with just a few well-placed hits. Each 20mm shell carried explosive and incendiary compounds. When it struck an Allied bomber, it didn't just punch holes, it detonated inside the aircraft, ripping apart internal structures, fuel tanks, and control cables. German pilots praised the MG-151-20 for its reliability and stopping power. A short burst was often enough to tear a wing off a fighter or set a bomber engine ablaze. This weapon marked a turning point where air combat became faster, deadlier, and far more unforgiving. Against formation of B-17 flying fortresses, the MG-151-20 proved effective but still insufficient alone. This realization pushed Germany toward even larger calibers, but the MG-151-20 remained the Luftwaffe's most versatile cannon throughout the war. If one weapon truly earned the title Flying Death Machine, it was the Mk108. This 30mm autocannon was built for a single purpose: destroying Allied heavy bombers as quickly as possible. Unlike high-velocity cannons, the Mk108 fired slower but massively destructive shells. Each round carried enough explosive power that just one or two hits could rip apart a B-17 or Lancaster bomber. Mounted on aircraft like the Bf-109 G6, FW-198, and the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter, the Mk108 turned interceptors into airborne executioners. German pilots could fire a brief burst and immediately disengage, knowing the damage was already fatal. The psychological effect was immense. Allied bomber crews reported aircraft exploding mid-air with no warning. Wings snapped off, fuselages disintegrated, and entire crews were lost in seconds. However, the weapon had drawbacks. Its low muzzle velocity required pilots to get dangerously close to enemy formation. Despite this, when used correctly, the Mk108 was devastating. The Mk108 symbolized the final evolution of German aircraft weapons, less about finesse, more about raw destructive power. As Allied aircraft became tougher, faster, and more heavily armored, the Luftwaffe faced a deadly problem. Rifle-caliber guns were no longer enough. German engineers responded with a brutal upgrade: the MG-131, a 30mm heavy machine gun that marked a critical step in turning German warplanes into true flying death machines. Introduced in the early 1940s, the MG-131 was designed to replace lighter weapons like the MG-17. Though it fired a larger and more powerful round, It was compact enough to be mounted in tight spaces, engine cowls, wings, and even defensive turrets. This made it incredibly versatile across many aircraft types. The MG-131 was widely installed on iconic aircraft such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109, Focke-Wulf Fw-190, Heinkel He-111, and Junkers Ju-88. In fighters, it often sat above the engine, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. In bombers, it served as a defensive weapon, giving crews a stronger chance of survival against enemy interceptors. What made the MG-131 especially dangerous was its ammunition. The 13mm rounds could be armor-piercing, incendiary, or high-explosive. When these bullets struck an enemy aircraft, they didn't just penetrate, they ignited fuel, shredded control systems, and wounded pilots with terrifying efficiency. With a firing rate of roughly 900 rounds per minute, the MG-131 delivered concentrated bursts of heavy fire. Allied pilots quickly learned that closing in on German bombers armed with MG-131 seconds was far more dangerous than earlier in the war. A single hit could cripple an engine or tear through a cockpit canopy. Despite its power, the MG-131 still had limits. Against heavy bombers like the B-17, it lacked the explosive punch of 20mm or 30mm cannons, but as a bridge between light machine guns and autocannons, it played a vital role in the Luftwaffe's escalating firepower. The MG-131 represents a turning point where German aircraft began shifting from precision shooting to raw destructive force. It was not the final answer, but it was a necessary step on the path that transformed German warplanes into airborne killing machines. The MGFF marked a decisive moment in aerial warfare when German aircraft weapons crossed the line from high-speed bullets to explosive destruction. This 20mm autocannon was among the first aircraft-mounted cannons to give Luftwaffe pilots the ability to destroy enemy planes with a single, well-placed hit. Developed from a Swiss Oerlikon design in the late 1930s, the MGFF entered service just as World War II began. It was installed on early German fighters, such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109E, as well as on bombers and ground attack aircraft. At a time when many air forces still relied heavily on machine guns, the MGFF gave Germany a terrifying technological edge. What made the MGFF so deadly was its ammunition. Instead of firing solid bullets, it launched 20mm high-explosive and incendiary shells. When these shells struck an aircraft, they detonated on impact, tearing open wings, shredding control surfaces, and igniting fuel vapors. Against lightly built fighters, even a single shell could be fatal. However, the MGFF was not without flaws. Its relatively low muzzle velocity made aiming difficult at long range, forcing pilots to close in dangerously close to their targets. In fast-moving dogfights, this limitation could mean life or death. Still, experienced pilots learned to exploit the weapon's strength, short-range ambush attacks, and deflection shots. The cannon saw extensive combat during the Battle of Britain, where it proved capable of destroying British fighters with brutal efficiency. RAF pilots often reported catastrophic damage from just one or two hits, reinforcing the growing fear of German cannon. Armed fighters. As the war progressed, the MGFF struggled against newer, heavily armored Allied bombers. This led to improved variants, and eventually its replacement by more advanced cannons like the MG-151-20. Yet the MGFF's legacy was already secured. It was the weapon that proved a simple truth: explosive shells belonged in the air. From that moment on, aerial combat would never be the same, and German warplanes took another step toward becoming flying death machines. By the middle years of World War II, air combat had evolved into a brutal contest of technology and firepower. German engineers needed a weapon that could hit hard, fire fast, and remain accurate at combat ranges. Their answer was the MG-151-20, a cannon many historians consider the most effective all-around aircraft weapon of the war. Originally designed as a 15mm cannon, the MG-151 was quickly modified to fire 20mm ammunition, dramatically increasing its destructive potential. This upgrade transformed it into a weapon capable of shredding fighters and crippling bombers with only a few hits. The MG-151-20 became standard armament on Germany's most famous aircraft, including the Messerschmitt Bf-109, Focke-Wulf Fw-190, Messerschmitt Me-410, and even bomber defensive mounts. Its versatility allowed it to be installed in the nose, wings, or engine-mounted firing positions. What made this cannon truly lethal was its ammunition design. High explosive and incendiary shells detonated after penetration, damaging internal structures rather than merely punching holes. A short burst could sever control cables, rupture fuel tanks, or destroy an engine. With a firing rate of around 700 to 750 rounds per minute, the MG-151-20 offered a rare combination: heavy firepower without sacrificing accuracy. German pilots valued it because it allowed controlled bursts rather than wild spraying, saving ammunition while maximizing lethality. Against Allied heavy bombers, the MG-151-20 proved far more effective than earlier weapons. While it could not always destroy a bomber instantly, repeated hits caused cumulative damage that forced aircraft out of formation or sent them down in flames. Even as larger cannons like the Mk108 entered service, many pilots still preferred the MG-151-20 for its reliability and precision. It represented the sweet spot between speed and destruction, a weapon that defined Luftwaffe air combat during the height of the war. The MG-151-20 didn't just arm German aircraft, it shaped how they fought, cementing their reputation as deadly predators of the sky. As Allied bombing campaigns intensified, German fighters faced an overwhelming threat: massive formations of heavily armored bombers that could absorb punishment and keep flying. To stop them, the Luftwaffe needed something radically more destructive. The result was the Mk108, a 30mm autocannon, designed with one terrifying goal: destroy bombers as fast as possible. Unlike earlier cannons that relied on speed and accuracy, the Mk108 focused purely on explosive power. Its shells were short, fat, and packed with high explosive filler. When a round struck an aircraft, it detonated violently, tearing apart internal structures instead of simply punching through metal skin. The Mk108 was mounted on late-war interceptors, such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109G series, Focke-Wulf FW-190A and D variants, and most famously, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. In the Me-262, 4 Mk108 cannons turned the world's first operational jet fighter into a bomber-killing nightmare. What made the Mk108 so deadly was efficiency. Just 1 to 3 hits were often enough to destroy a B-17 Flying Fortress or Avro Lancaster. Wings snapped, fuselages split open, and aircraft exploded mid-air. Allied crews sometimes had no warning: one moment flying in formation, the next vanishing in fire. However, this power came with trade-offs. The Mk108 had a low muzzle velocity, meaning shells dropped quickly, and required pilots to get dangerously close, often within 200 meters before firing. This placed German pilots inside the deadly defensive gun range of Allied bombers. Despite the risk, experienced pilots learned to strike with precision: fast head-on attacks, short bursts, and immediate breakaways. When used correctly, the Mk108 was devastating beyond anything the Allies had faced before. The Mk108 represented the brutal final phase of German aircraft armament. It abandoned finesse in favor of raw destruction, transforming German interceptors into true flying death machines built to tear bombers out of the sky. While the Mk108 relied on overwhelming explosive force, German engineers also pursued a different solution: speed and penetration. The answer was the Mk103, a powerful 30mm autocannon designed to combine accuracy, range, and devastating impact. This weapon represented a more refined but equally lethal evolution in German aircraft armament. Introduced later in the war, the Mk103 was engineered with a much higher muzzle velocity than the Mk108. This allowed German pilots to engage targets from longer distances and with greater accuracy, an essential advantage when facing tight bomber formations protected by heavy defensive fire. The Mk103 was mounted on specialized aircraft such as the Henschel HS-129 ground attack aircraft, certain FW-190 variants, and experimental bomber-destroyer platforms. Its role was flexible. It could tear through aircraft structures in the air or obliterate armored vehicles on the ground. What made the Mk103 especially dangerous was its ammunition. Armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds could punch through reinforced bomber sections before detonating inside. Against Allied aircraft, this meant engines shattered, wings fractured, and fuselages ruptured with terrifying consistency. Unlike the Mk108's close-range ambush style, the Mk100 3 allowed pilots to fire from safer engagement distances, reducing exposure to defensive guns. This made it particularly effective in head-on attacks against bombers, one of the most dangerous but rewarding tactics in aerial warfare. However, the Mk-103's power came at a cost. It was heavier and mechanically complex, limiting how widely it could be installed. Recoil and weight also affected aircraft handling, making it unsuitable for many fighter designs. Despite these limitations, the Mk-103 proved that German aircraft weapons had reached a new level of sophistication. It blended brute force with precision, pushing the concept of flying death machines closer to its ultimate form. The Mk-103 was not just a cannon, it was a statement. German warplanes would fight with maximum lethality at any range. As World War II intensified, Germany pushed aircraft weaponry beyond traditional air-to-air combat. The Luftwaffe began mounting anti-tank cannons on aircraft, transforming them into flying artillery platforms. One of the most fearsome results of this shift was the BK 3.7, a massive 37mm cannon capable of destroying both aircraft and armored ground targets. The BK 3.7 was adapted from a ground-based anti-aircraft gun and modified for airborne use. This alone shows how desperate and innovative German engineers had become, firing enormous 37mm shells. The BK 3.7 delivered destructive power that few aircraft weapons could match. The cannon was most famously mounted on the Junkers Ju-87 Kanonenvogel, the cannon bird. Slung beneath the wings in bulky pods, the BK 3.7 turned the slow Stuka dive bomber into a deadly tank hunter. Each shell was capable of penetrating heavy armor, making it especially lethal against Soviet tanks on the Eastern Front. Against aircraft, a single hit was catastrophic. A 37mm shell didn't just damage a plane, it tore it apart. Wings snapped, fuselages shattered, and engines disintegrated instantly. However, due to its low rate of fire and limited ammunition capacity, the BK 3.7 was not ideal for traditional dogfighting. Pilots using the BK 3.7 had to rely on precision rather than volume of fire. Attacks were carefully planned, often from behind or above unsuspecting targets. When successful, the results were devastating. Veteran pilots became specialists, feared by enemy ground forces and respected even by their opponents. The cannon's massive size and recoil affected aircraft performance, reducing speed and maneuverability. This made planes carrying the BK 3.7 vulnerable to enemy fighters, requiring careful escort and tactical planning. The BK 3.7 represented the moment German aircraft truly became multi-role death machines, capable of destroying both air and ground targets with terrifying efficiency. It was a weapon that blurred the line between aircraft and artillery. As Allied bomber formations grew larger and more heavily defended, Germany pursued an extreme solution: destroy bombers before entering their defensive gun range. The result was the BK-5, a monstrous 50mm aircraft cannon that pushed the concept of airborne firepower to its absolute limit. The BK-5 was adapted from the 50mm Bak 38 anti-tank gun, redesigned to fire automatically from an aircraft. This alone made it one of the most ambitious and intimidating aircraft weapons of World War II. Its shells were enormous, each capable of catastrophic damage with a single hit. The cannon was primarily mounted on the Messerschmitt Me 410 heavy fighter, where it was installed in the nose. From a distance of over 1,000 meters, the BK-5 could punch through bomber armor and detonate inside the fuselage. This allowed German pilots to attack Allied bombers from ranges previously considered impossible. When a 50mm shell struck a bomber, the results were horrifying. Entire sections of the aircraft were blown apart. Wings failed, cockpits were obliterated, and engines were torn from their mounts. In some cases, bombers simply disintegrated mid-air. However, the BK-5 came with severe drawbacks. The cannon was extremely heavy, drastically affecting aircraft performance. Planes equipped with it were slower, less maneuverable, and highly vulnerable to escort fighters. Ammunition capacity was also very limited, often fewer than 25 rounds. Accuracy was another challenge. While devastating when it hit, landing a successful shot at long range again. Moving targets required exceptional pilot skill and perfect conditions. As Allied fighter escorts increased, opportunities to use the BK-5 effectively became rare. Despite its limitations, the BK-5 symbolized Germany's last desperate leap in aerial weapon development. It represented the belief that bigger guns could still turn the tide of the air war. The BK-5 transformed German aircraft into long-range executioners, capable of delivering death from beyond retaliation, at least in theory. It was the ultimate expression of the flying death machine philosophy.